Thank you very much. I want to first, like so many of the speakers today, have thanked the organizers of this conference. Honestly, I've spoken at conferences like this around the world, and this is literally maybe the most professionally run conference that I've been at. And so I want to thank the organizers for putting on such a great show. We're here today, all of us, I think, because we believe trade is good. And in fact, when I talk about the eBay perspective on trade, I often say, if you don't believe that trade is good and the market economics actually work, then none of the rest of what I say is going to matter. So I think in this form, though, the group pretty much is all here today, number one, believing that trade is good. And I must say that much of the discussion today has been a little depressing. It's been a lot of data about the fact that trade is not growing now like it was growing a decade ago, and in fact we can fight over what's the right numbers to look at as to whether or not it's actually shrinking, and then depressing questions around why and around the political dynamics around the world and whether that's only going to make things worse. And so there's been a little bit of a depressing feeling, I would say. And one of the things that's been hinted at is whether or not there is some hope for the future. And I would in fact refer back to the opening presentation today, Professor Irwin, who's basically laid out the fact that if you look at broader, like multi-decade sort of slots of time, there was relatively steady but lower growth of trade, and then there was about a decade and a half around the 1990s where it boomed, and then we're kind of back to a growth rate that looks like sort of the pre-boom period. And so it caused me, while I was a little free time, I went to the internet on my mobile device, my Korean-made Samsung mobile device, and looked up and was reminded of the Industrial Revolution and the fact that there wasn't just one Industrial Revolution, there were actually a couple of periods, of cycles of stronger growth. And maybe that's the case with trade. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about, is the idea, and maybe I would tweak the language up there, maybe leveraging trade as an engine for new growth is what we're really looking for. And the eBay perspective is that what the digital revolution and the internet in particular, and platforms even more particularly, has done is opened up the economics of trade, which we all agree is good, to so many more enterprises around the world that it's almost staggering to think about. So it's based on, again, this idea that there's a new kind of small and micro business, and maybe micro business is the key idea, because the businesses that are operating on eBay are primarily, they're not small like 100 employees or even 50 employees. They're often 10 and fewer. They operate on a kind of trade that is based on platforms. We call it at the eBay Public Policy Lab the Global Empowerment Network, and this was primarily to create a different phrase than global value chains. Because the micro businesses using the internet to trade globally are not primarily part of a global value chain. Instead, they're operating what is on basically a multi-layered set of platforms. And those platforms are the network platform, the internet basically, commerce platforms, eBay being just one, but we've already had references to Alibaba, Amazon's marketplace, Etsy. There are platforms for commerce. You need then the platforms for payments, because if you can't get paid by a consumer on the other side of the world, you're not going to be able to make a sale. And then actually platforms for logistics. The idea behind these platforms is that these micro businesses will never be able to have their own infrastructure to do all these things like the traditional big global corporation model, but instead, by accessing platforms, they can replicate the same thing and become traders. If you go to the internet and you Google eBay Public Policy Lab, you'll end up seeing a bunch of reports that my team has put out. This set of slides is not for anybody to try to figure out what all those numbers are right here, but to basically point out that what we've looked at is the trade activity of the micro businesses on eBay. And this is basically anybody who sells 10,000 US dollars or more in a year. So that's, you can't even really support even one person in most countries on just 10,000 in sales. And then look at their trade activity. And we look at four particular measurements of trade. And I would compare these numbers to traditional small businesses, most of whom never trade at all. Because in the traditional economy, you simply cannot engage in global commerce when you're a four-person, tiny little retailer of shoes somewhere. So, the share of the eBay-enabled SMEs that export, that would be graph number 1 up there, chart number 1. The range, we looked last year, we did a report with 18 countries, 9 of them emerging economies, 9 of them advanced economies, and I'll just say that across the board, it ranges from 88% to 100%. Korea happens to be a country with 100% exporting by the SMEs that sell on eBay. The lowest percentage, by the way, 88% was in Australia, where I presume that their literal physical removal from so many markets is a real challenge. Now, by the way, Korean, their own internal economic numbers indicate that they believe 20% of traditional small businesses export. My guess is that that is ignoring in large part micro businesses, but that shows you the difference between the internet-enabled model versus the non-internet enabled. The second stat is the share of the eBay-enabled SMEs that sell to 10 or more markets. This is very different than the model for global value chains, where small businesses often trade to just a partner or two in the value chain and might sell to just 1 or 2 countries. The Korean number is 98%. So 98% of the SMEs trading on the eBay platform from Korea sell to 10 or more countries per year. Across the 18 countries, that runs from 38% to, in fact, the 98% for Korea. The third is the average number of foreign market destinations. Across the 18 countries, it ranges from 12 countries on average to 63. Korean small businesses on eBay sell to 57 countries per year on eBay. And lastly, we have a statistic regarding, to give a perspective of global reach, the number of continents, where the percentage of the businesses that sell to consumers on 4 or more continents per year, the Korean business number on eBay is 98%. Long story short, as I think Josh indicated as well, if you're a small business that sells on eBay and you do just $10,000 a year, you will almost guaranteed to be an exporter. So, what does this mean? On one hand, we list policy recommendations, and I'll pull out of this list 3 quick ones in particular. That is de minimis levels, essentially having a low value threshold where countries are not trying to impose their customs or VAT taxes at the border, is the sort of single shot way to promote this kind of trade, which translates into growth. Number 2, eliminating all taxes at the border on cross-border returns. You would be shocked by the fact that when a small business exports on a commerce platform like eBay, and the customer tries to return the good because they're not happy for some reason, which we all know happens with e-commerce, there are oftentimes taxes that get applied coming back in. It's ridiculous and should be eliminated to promote small business trade. And lastly, treating postal systems increasingly as trade facilitation networks is key, because this is package level trade, and the national posts around the world are critical to this kind of trade. I'm going to close with one final thing. I was actually trying to explain to a colleague of mine in Washington the idea that what really needs to happen is a change in trade mindset. and that is the world of trade. And that's all the people in this room and people like us all around the world who work on trade policy have developed a mindset over the decades that trade is about a relatively small number of very big enterprises engaging in commerce in a way that can be measured and followed and tracked. And I was trying to say that if we move to a world where nearly every enterprise can trade, that mindset is not just challenged, but may need to change. And it should change because of the growth opportunities. And I was saying it's like if you had a group of people who were wildlife managers and they had spent their career in the Arctic and they were counting polar bears and walruses and seals, and they kept track of all the polar bears and the walruses and seals, and then you moved them and you said, okay, now you need to track all the wildlife, and you put them on the African Serengeti. And it turned out that most of the living organisms were like bugs. And these were people who'd always thought that the key to their job was to count every polar bear and keep track every year and know when they moved around. And then now they were faced with a completely different kind of ecosystem. The future can have a different ecosystem which has more growth, more opportunity, and more inclusive trade, but yet it's a challenge for even the believers in the trade system to have to adapt to this new model. Thank you.